Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin and tips for navigating the bear market. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out the Telegram channel, which you can find a link to in the description below. Now, I made a video on tips for navigating the bear market a couple of months ago, but I wanted to provide an update to it and kind of see where we are today. Now, a lot of the tips remain the same, but I wanted to continue to add to it and to just try to help people get through this phase of the market that we're in. It's a pretty difficult phase. We've been through it many times before. We'll eventually get through it, but you need to come up with a strategy and stick to it. And in this video, I want to try to help you figure out a strategy that works for you. So the last time we did this video was back on February 21st, and you can see that a couple of the points I was making here: cash is king and alts are risky. Okay, cash is king and alts are risky. And despite the fact that this video is 2.5 months ago, the price of Bitcoin is more or less the same. I mean, we're currently at around 30, just below $36,000. Back then we were at 38,000, but we know we've been sort of all over the place since then, right? So right now we're at 35.8. Now, what I said back then, I still think holds true through today, and that is cash is king. It's a difficult concept, I think, for a lot of people to agree with, and I also don't expect everyone to agree with it. I mean, we all have our opinions, of course, and being correct, I guess, is always somewhat subjective. But when we talk about cash being king, the reason I say that is because when you're in a market, when you're just in a bear market, what happens is pumps just get sold off, okay? And they have a way of sort of sucking you back into the market. So maybe you decided to cash some crypto out, and then the market starts to pump, and then you FOMO in, chasing that dream, and then the market just gives it all back the next day. Okay, this happens a lot in a bear market, and so you need to remember that cash remains king. Okay, so cash is king remains number one, and it'll still remain number one for a while. The reason I say cash is king not only is because of the pumps and whatnot, but it's also because you need to have cash in hand in order to theoretically buy whatever the future bottom is going to be. I mean, this is somewhat of a like a hard concept to some degree, because it's like you don't actually know what the bottom is. But when we're in a bear market and you're just sort of seeing weekly Heikin-Ashi candles with large candle bodies, no upper shadows and lower shadows, we're just in a clear downtrend, right? You can see it on the weekly. If you go to the 2-week, there's very few of these green candles. And if you go to the monthly, you can see there haven't been any of these green weekly Heikin-Ashi candles. So the theory here is that cash will remain king. Now, for people that like Bitcoin, this is a tough concept to agree with, because with cash, the purchasing power is ultimately trending towards zero. At least with an investment, there's a chance that it won't trend towards zero. The problem is that markets everywhere remain risk off, right? They completely remain risk off. We just did a video on this yesterday where we spoke about inflation, and if you look at historical times when inflation has been skyrocketing in the United States, all of these times, generally speaking, we didn't really see great years until after it reversed course. Okay, so like in 1975 when it reversed course, and in 1980 when it reversed course. But you don't really see many great moves by the stock market when it's moving higher like this. And so, yes, the idea is that cash will ultimately lose its value, but the counter argument is that when we're in a highly inflationary period and the Fed is having to fight that, the argument is, yeah, your fiat's going to lose purchasing power in the short term, but I mean, where else are you going to put it? I mean, this is a tough thing, right? So you need to consider that cash remains king. All right, that's number one. Number two that I spoke about over here is that alts are risky. And, I just wanted to take a minute to remind people of why alts are risky. Okay, if you look at this chart over here, look at where these altcoins were at the time. All right, Ethereum is holding up relatively well. You can see back then it was at 26.43, and today Ethereum is at 26.65. So it's doing okay, but I also would consider Ethereum a blue chip. If you look at some of the other altcoins in this chart, ADA was at 92 cents. Now ADA is at 77 cents. Okay, DOT was at 16.61. Now it's just over $14. Um, Litecoin was at 108 and XRP was at 75 cents. And if you go look at Litecoin and XRP, you can see that 95 cents and 59 cents, right? So that they've both taken a hit. Matic was at $1.50, Uni was at 9.12. So $1.50 and 9.12. And then finally you can see that Matic now is at $1.02 and then Uni is at 7.44. So what do you notice? Yeah, Bitcoin's taken a little bit of a hit, but a lot of these altcoins are down a lot. And I want to remind you, altcoins remain very risky, and it sort of goes against this idea of buy the dip. Okay, you're used to this mindset of buying the dip for a long time because historically that works out. But unfortunately, when you're in a bear market, buying the altcoin dip does not tend to work out. The reason is because, again, we're just in a bear market. Now, your counterpoint could be, well, Ben, if everyone's bearish, doesn't that mean it's a good thing? Doesn't that mean we're actually bullish? No, unfortunately not. The reason is because the crowd is often right in the middle of trends. If you think back to late 2020 and early 2021, basically everyone was bullish. I didn't really become super bearish until April, after Bitcoin had gone to the highest risk band in March. That was when I became very bearish, and that's why I thought we needed to go down for the summer. But you didn't really see a lot of people being bearish back then, and then slowly some people started to become bearish, right? I mean, I became bearish, in March once we hit that 0.9 to 1 risk level, and then I do think there were some other bearish people, and then we ultimately went down for a while. But then, right, what happens is what was it wrong for people to be bullish and to assume it was going to go up? No. I still remember when Bitcoin broke above 20K and people were calling for 60K. Like everyone was calling for 40K, 50K, 60K. I mean, all the way up to 100K. So yes, the crowd generally gets things wrong at extremes. Okay, that's where it's hard to pivot, is at extremes. It's really hard to. Now, this is something that happens quite a bit. Okay, so yes, you could argue that because people are bearish, maybe the market's bullish, but I do think that's a bit of an overgeneralization. It's only at extremes. So like once everyone thinks the market is in a bear market, that's when typically we'll be out of the bear market. And I've made that comment many times. The bear market will end once everyone admits it is a bear market, and not until then. The same thing happened in 2018, guys. I mean, I was there for it. I imagine many of you guys were as well. And for a long time, people were calling this a bull market because technically we were putting in higher lows, and then ultimately we didn't, and we started to go lower. And then they were still calling it a bull market here because, well, technically we were still holding 6K. By the time the floor fell out and we went to 3K, you finally had people admitting it was a bear market. But at that point, the bear market was over. Okay, so that is the reason altcoins remain risky. Okay, is that Bitcoin is fundamentally in a bear market. And one of the reasons Bitcoin is in a bear market is because, as I said before, we are risk off. Now, how can we be risk off when inflation is sky high? Wasn't that why Bitcoin was created, to be a hedge against inflation? Well, you have to understand that, fiat is inflationary basically at all times. I mean, for the most part. Except for some historic deflationary periods, but for the most part, it's just always inflationary. And Bitcoin does really well, right? Because it's a hedge against that. The problem is that when inflation starts to shoot up, in a parabolic fashion, yes, Bitcoin is a hedge against inflation, but it's not a hedge against what the Fed's going to do and if they're going to turn the money printers off. It's not a hedge against people actually having, cheap money, if that makes sense, and being able to go out and purchase things with it. Okay, so access to capital is harder now for people in general. We're not printing money as much as we were, and the Fed is just generally hawkish. So because of all of that, altcoins remain risky. As I said back over here, right? Altcoins remain highly risky. And until Bitcoin either capitulates or shows strength, that will be the same. I think that sort of mentality stands. So number one, cash is king. Number two, altcoins are risky. That hasn't changed, right? This has not changed at all. Number three is that, and this one I really need to stress. If you are of the, if you think that this is the time to buy altcoins, because if you think that, I can't convince you otherwise, right? But if you think it, make sure you go with the ones that you actually think will stand the test of time. I can't tell you how many people have reached out. I mean, you guys know I don't do any paid promotions or any affiliate links, right? But I get probably 10 solicitations to promote random micro caps that you've never heard of, I've never heard of. Really, there's no business hearing about them in the first place, but I see them getting desperate, and I want you to remember you need to protect your capital during this time. Okay, so cash is king, altcoins are risky. Don't give your money to the BS projects that have nothing more than a fancy WordPress site that could have been coded by a middle schooler. So please protect your capital as best as you can. One of the ways to do that is to remember cash is king, and also risky, right? That's one of the things you can do. And again, I'm not saying you should specifically do anything, but keep those principles in mind, that cash is king and that altcoins are risky, and that all of these attempts to lure you into these micro caps, just ignore them, right? Why? Because no one cares about that stuff right now, right? Like we're in a risk off environment. Okay, the dollar remains in a parabolic uptrend, and we could be going up for a while potentially. Maybe we'll go to 112 or 113 before this thing cools down. I don't know, but you need to understand the markets are risk off, right? The Nasdaq is putting in lower lows. Not only is the Nasdaq putting in lower lows, but you take a look at the S&P, it's putting in lower lows. How can you look at this and say this is a risk on market? It's just simply not. Now, does that mean that we can't have short-term rallies where it makes you feel like you're missing out? It's sort of like if you had sold some stocks right here, then the S&P then rocketed back up. It didn't stop it from just coming right back down. So in the same manner, if you had, say, like an altcoin, there's always a chance that if you go to sell it, you might sell it at whatever the local bottom is, and then it's just going to pump, and then you feel like, oh, you finally missed, you missed out on it after holding it for so long. One thing I would say to help protect that is just if you buy something or if you sell something, you don't have to go all in or all out. It's just some piece of advice. Now, this next one is difficult, and I mean, this is a really difficult one. I keep seeing people talk about an imminent alt season, right? An imminent alt season. And, I can't, I have to keep saying this, and I said it back in the video back then too, and I've been saying it for months. There is likely no immediate alt season. Okay, you do not generally get alt seasons when Bitcoin's in a downtrend below its bull market support band. These are not the right conditions for an alt season. They're just not. Do you think there's enough confidence in this market for an alt season? Even if Bitcoin did rally back up to, say, 44K, 46K, yeah, you might see alt stretch the legs, but you're likely not looking at like months and months of like 50% gains every single week for, 3 or 4 months straight. You're likely not looking at that right now. So the thing you need to think about here is there is likely no imminent alt season. Okay, the charts just do not fundamentally support that idea. Now, the counterpoint that someone might make would be to say, well, Ben, every time Bitcoin has topped out like this, it generally has a dead cat bounce where we do go through an alt season. The counterpoint, and I've said this many times so far, the counterpoint is that 64K was the technical top, and this was the dead cat bounce, right? This was the alt season. So the alt season that people are waiting for already happened, okay? Now, I've said this before. Yes, Bitcoin technically went to a higher price in November, right? It did. Technically, it did. But by every other metric, more or less, it put in a lower high, right? Look at the weekly RSI. I mean, it was just a much lower. We barely even made it to overbought conditions when we were back in November, right? You can look at a lot of other metrics as well. Besides the RSI, you look at social statistics, you look at on-chain data. Technically, the technical top by a lot of standards was actually back at 64K. Somehow it was like we memed ourselves to 69K. And as I've said before, I don't get all of these things right. I mean, I try to be as open and honest as I can. I did a good job here, and I did not here. I got wrecked here. I mean, I sold a lot of Bitcoin here, bought a lot of it back, but this is a really tough thing to navigate when it just goes up slightly higher. Um, and then we come all the way back down. But I think you need to recognize, and as I've been saying since we've been below the bull market support band, this is a bear market. Okay, this is not just a brief bear market where we're going to immediately go back and put in new all-time highs. You might say, well, isn't this the same thing as over here? It's not, right? It's actually not. I hate to say that, but it's not. And the reason why it's not is because the macro environment is completely different. I mean, the Fed, don't fight the Fed, right? This another tip to live by here is don't fight the Fed. So if you do accept that cash is king and that alts are risky, and if you are saving up, then remember, one of the key things to figure out when you might want to go back to risk on is once the Fed pivots. So just be patient and wait for the Fed to pivot. They'll pivot eventually once inflation gets under control, but more than likely. But until that time, I don't really think there's any reason to assume that we're immediately going back to risk on. So again, I would caution people, if you are waiting for an alt season and that's constantly what's sort of keeping you pouring all this money into all these altcoins in anticipation of a sustained alt season, I hate to break it to you, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. You kind of need to wake up and face the music here and realize that an alt season is likely not around the corner. And that's the same thing I said back in February, that altcoins are risky, and you need to understand that the November move here was arguably a dead cat bounce. Okay, and we technically put in a higher price, but Bitcoin's more or less been in a bear market since May of 2021, or even April of 2021. You could argue that it's just been in a bear market ever since then. So again, I know it's a difficult thing to accept, but I do think that's where we currently are right now. Okay, I do think Bitcoin is frankly in a bear market, and normally once we go below the 50-week SMA, and especially once we start holding resistance, we then go to the 100-week SMA, which is where we are right now. And then after going to the 100-week SMA, historically, we go to the 200, right? Break below the 50, consolidate at the 100, eventually you go to the 200. Same thing here, break below the 50, you go to the 100, eventually you go to the 2. 50, 100, 200, 50, we're currently at the 100, okay? So, look, I know these things aren't necessarily the music to your ears, right? And we could have a nice short-term bounce for all we know. But I will remind you that bear markets are difficult for everyone, just because the overall sentiment is pretty bad. The one thing that can make them better is recognizing that they're here. Okay, if you ignore their presence, then you do not follow any of the general strategies for preserving your wealth in a bear market. Okay, so like if you think about it, if we were just to assume that we're in a bull market, then you always think about basically like buying the dip, right? You just think about, okay, I need to buy the dip, buy the dip, buy the dip. But if the dip keeps on dipping, you might run out of chips to scoop up the dip with. And I got to tell you guys, the worst feeling in the world is watching Bitcoin go, say, to the 200-week moving average and seeing cheap altcoins below prices than you ever would have imagined possible and not having any capital to buy that stuff up. That's the worst feeling in the world. And I've experienced it before. I experienced it in 2014. I mean, look, guys, I got wrecked over here and I was buying on the way down. By the time we were down here, I didn't have anything left to put in the market. In fact, I kind of thought crypto was dead. I became very apathetic towards it. And then in 2016 and 2017, I was pleasantly surprised. And I said, you know what? It kind of sucks to be over here, but I'm not going to sell it because if Bitcoin ever goes back up, I'm going to benefit from it. I was like, I don't know if it will, but if it ever does, I'm going to benefit from it. So I kept it. And then in 2018, I got a little bit better and I started averaging in over here. And I kept some cash on hand though, even though I thought 6K could be the bottom, because like you today, I kept thinking, well, how can it go much lower, right? Like how, could it go much lower than this? Like, could it go below $6,000? Back then, that wasn't really something that a lot of people spoke about. I mean, I think the consensus opinion, for the most part, I mean, there were people that were bearish, I know, but most people back then were bullish at 6K, and we were just sort of waiting for it to go back up. And then the floor fell out, we dropped 50%, and it was like, the wind was taken out of your sails. And the thing is, though, is the one thing I learned in 2018 that I didn't do in 2014 is I actually kept some cash. I kept cash here so that I actually had some money if the market dropped. I didn't know it was going to drop, but I made sure I had a cash position in case it did. Okay? And I had it ready to go. So here today, similar position. The main difference for me today, as opposed to back then, is I've actually become more risk averse, and I have more cash in terms of a percentage of my portfolio here than I did over here because I've learned my lesson. Like here, I didn't have any. Here, I had some. Here, I have even more. Okay, so if we come back down to these lower levels, I want to make sure I have cash to take advantage of that. Okay, so cash is king. Alts are risky. The micro cap altcoins, I mean, there's a time and a place for them, but I can assure you it's not now, and it's also not on this channel, right? It's not on this channel. So I will say though, for those that keep throwing money into these black holes that just sort of suck your money away, it's likely not a good strategy in the short term. Okay, and I don't really talk about micro caps on the channel, but I see all sorts of quick cash grabs going around trying to get you to give them their money when really they're just trying to sort of like absorb the last little bit of money they can before they just call it quits for a while. So there's a lot of things here I think that are worth understanding and frankly worth admitting. Say, hey, we're in a bear market, and I know whenever I say it, there's some people that give me some flack for it, but I call it like I see it. If it walks like a bear market and it squawks like one, you might as well call it what it is. And right now, with Bitcoin flirting with a potential lower low, which somehow we still have not put in yet, which I mean, I gotta say, is somewhat impressive. I don't know when it's going to come. I guess I don't know if it's going to come, but if and when it comes, you need to be prepared because if the floor falls out, let me switch this back over to the normal candle so you can see it. If the floor falls out here and Bitcoin goes below, say, 34.4, right? If we go back down to the 33s, then we've put in a lower low. That is where the dominance likely goes up a lot for Bitcoin, right? That is where it would likely go up. If you go back to 2018, it was in June of 2018 that the dominance shot up. And as I'll remind you, in June of 2018, that was when Bitcoin put in its first lower low, okay? And it was in June of 2018. We were putting in higher lows. And then in June 2018, we put in a lower low. Bitcoin dominance went up. Altcoins were risky, right? Same thing today. Altcoins remain really risky. Bitcoin is technically putting in higher lows. And altcoins are sort of hanging on for dear life, right? They're holding on for dear life at this point. Now, I suppose you should at least consider, the alternative, and that what is Bitcoin holding the line on this uptrend somehow? Like, if a miracle occurs and Bitcoin sort of just bounces off of this and we eventually go put in new all-time highs, sort of like 2013 did. Like if you look at these, like you can see that, 2013, the angle of attack was steeper, but 2013 was putting in higher lows and then ultimately went up to another peak. I would still argue if you need exposure to the market, Bitcoin could be that exposure because I still think that altcoins likely aren't going to do anything in a sustainable way until either Bitcoin capitulates or goes parabolic, right? It's got to do one of those things. If you're going to get out of bed for altcoins going up 15% a day and then just watching those gains disappear the next day, that's not really what I'm looking for, right? I'm looking for long-term investments, like good value on altcoins. And I'll keep saying, altcoins remain incredibly risky during this time. So I think some of the strategies that you could probably employ at this point are to just remember that cash is king. You need to be patient. Altcoins remain risky. If you need exposure to the asset class, Bitcoin's probably where you want to be. Maybe ETH, but I do think there's a good chance ETH is going to bleed against Bitcoin in the second half of this year, just like it normally does, last year being the exception. So we'll see what happens. I'm not, I do think it's worth tempering your expectations in the short term. And the reason I say that is because those who have the patience now, who don't throw all their money into garbage microcaps to never see that money again, those who have the patience will ultimately be able to come in later with a lot more capital and then set their future selves up for success. You're not going to be able to set your future self up for success if literally every single week you're throwing your money into altcoins when when Bitcoin's in a bear market. Doesn't mean we can't come out of it eventually, but my motto is this at this point for Bitcoin and with altcoins: either show me capitulation or show me strength. And if I don't get either one of those, then altcoins remain highly risky. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video on tips for navigating the bear market. I mean, there's a lot of different ways that you can sort of tackle this bear market. There's a lot of different strategies that you might want to employ. I'm fairly risk averse, probably more risk averse than most of you. But I think if you go in with a mentality right now of trying to preserve wealth rather than trying to create it, you'll do a lot better in this risk off macro environment. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and I'll see you next time. Bye.